Good evening. Before I begin my remarks, I just want to note that this is tonight will be the keynote address of a conference which runs all day tomorrow from 8:30 to 4:15. And the program for that conference is available in the back of the room. So please feel free to attend the conference. It's open to everyone. It'll be held right here in the Walker Haynes room. So please do plan on attending. Also, because this conference is funded with taxpayer dollars, that means that the citizens have reason to want to make sure that their monies are well spent, and so there are also evaluation forms. So if before you leave this evening you could fill out a form assessing the event, we'd appreciate that very much. Before I introduce tonight's distinguished lecturer, I'd like to first acknowledge the support and hard work that made this 20th anniversary conference on the Legacies of German Unification possible. The conference is jointly offered by Indiana University and the University of Washington through our National Resource Centers in European Studies, and we are very grateful for the grant support of the U.S. Department of Education, as well as grant support from the European Union through its European Union Center of Excellence program. Here at the University of Washington, the conference has been co-organized with the Germanics Department under the leadership of Professor Sabine Wilke, and enjoys the support of the Simpson Center for the Humanities. I'd like personally to thank our Associate Director, Phil Shackleton, our Outreach Coordinator, Ava Dunn, and the rest of our indefatigable staff at the Center for West European Studies for all their hard work in bringing this conference together. Finally, I'd like to thank all the participants in the conference, particularly those that have traveled so far to such a dark and rainy city to join us. And that is true of our keynote speaker as well. Indeed, it's a great honor to be able to introduce our distinguished lecturer this evening, Dr. Konrad Jarausch, Legacy Professor of European Civilization at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Professor Jarausch, born in Magdeburg, earned his doctorate in German history from the University of Wisconsin. He taught for 15 years at the University of Missouri before joining the history faculty as Legacy Professor at Chapel Hill in 1983. Professor Jarausch has performed extraordinary service to the historical profession and modern German studies on both sides of the Atlantic. In 1994, he helped to co-found Chapel Hill Center for European Studies and served as its co-director through 1998. From 1998 through 2006, Professor Jarausch split his time between North Carolina and Potsdam, Germany, where he served as director of the Center for Contemporary Historical Studies. In that role, Professor Jarausch played a vital part in rethinking the recent German past, in the assessment and reconstruction of East German historical profession, and in mentoring a new generation of German historians eager to investigate and reevaluate the contemporary history of the two Germanies. In addition to this service, he served on boards and steering committees of numerous academic organizations, research foundations, and scholarly journals. He was president of the German Studies Association and principal editor of the journal Studies in Contemporary History. Professor Jarausch's scholarly achievements are dazzling, even humbling, at least to a journeyman scholar like me. He's held more than a half dozen prestigious research fellowships and has won more than 50 research and program grants. He's the author of more than 200 scholarly articles and book chapters, and has written and edited some 30 books. Alas, many lesser scholars will be fortunate enough to get through the collected writings of Jarausch, never mind their reading even a sample of the important scholarly debates and historiographical discussions to which he has contributed. To give you a sense of the breadth and achievement of his career, let me briefly mention some of the principal subjects that Professor Jarausch's monographs have explored. These include benchmark studies of politics and foreign policy in Imperial Germany, studies of students and professionals in the Wilhelmine and Weimar periods, as well as works on the practices of historiography and historical methods. Let me note something rather extraordinary. Professor Jarausch is among the very few historians to have written forcibly on the proper application of both quantitative methods and postmodern methods in historical sciences. The capacity and willingness to embrace both appropriately indicates a rare intellect and openness of mind. More recently, he became one of the leading practitioners in contemporary German history, with major studies of German democratization after 1945, studies of East Germany and its collapse, works on the process of German unification, and the social history of the two Germanys since the Second World War. A recent work, for example, is this, After Hitler, Recivilizing Germans 1945-1995, which appeared with Oxford University Press. I'll conclude by recognizing Professor Jarausch as a legendary advisor and mentor of students. Despite his level of scholarly and professional engagement, he is presently advising no less than 15 graduate students at Chapel Hill. Dozens of practicing historians have him to thank for their professional training and ongoing development. Although I ultimately found my vocation in sociology, I earned an MA in history under Professor Jarausch's direction. In 1992, it was he that urged me to get into the recently opened archives of the former East Germany, a course of action that eventually led to a dissertation and my recently published book on the social dynamics of communist collapse. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jarausch.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I guess I'm at the age where, as Ted Hammer used to say about me, you begin to bask in the reflected glory of your students. I'm pleased to be back in Seattle because it's such a fascinating city and one of the leading institutions of public higher education in this country. And I'm glad that you are also interested in German and European studies, that they have been revitalized in the last decade or so. That is something that you all ought to be proud of. Now tonight, I have prepared a PowerPoint which is quite out of character because I am not good at that. And I can only justify my clumsy efforts in this direction by the fact that I wanted to show you pictures, because the images of 1989-90 are a very crucial part of the process. And if I had just talked about it in a kind of abstract fashion, you would be missing some of the gripping scenes that I hope I have for you. I have, of course, also an academic text in my briefcase, and if somebody would like to insist on my reading an article with footnotes, I could do that. I have a feeling at this hour of the evening, and with a somewhat broader audience, we would be better off if we just went ahead and tried to see what this was going to be like. So, Germany, 1989, a new type of revolution. Let me begin by talking about the celebration of the 20th anniversary of the fall of the wall, which in Germany have been very strong, more so than in some other East European countries, because I think the Germans are particularly proud of what has happened, and in spite of all the difficulties of post-unification, they are not as disappointed as some of the other East Europeans. Of course, Timothy Garton-Ash is right, who has flatly asserted that this is the most important European event since 1945. And since I have not read that article before, I had also said it. So we can quarrel about who came up with it first. The point is that it is correct because more things changed due to 1989, 1990 than due to any other event, including 1968, which some of us, sort of fondly remember. Is also kind of a cohort problem that some of the students don't have. And this time around, of course, this all happened in a peaceful fashion. Now, the meaning of all of this is sharply contested by memory politics, which go into various kinds of directions because there is a sort of, after the event, justification of anti-communism and the kind of triumphalism often associated with these events in the West. There's, of course, some degree of sorrow and confusion associated with these events on the side of the socialist left. And then some of us who are trying to find our way between these two extremes, of course, are trying to make sense out of this and appreciate the contradictions in the process. There has been a great deal of writing and even more speechifying on this, but I have seen hardly any new interpretations. This I find astounding. Because, okay, on one level I can understand it because people like to tell stories. This is okay. It's like the Kennedy assassination and stuff like this. Where were you on the evening of the 9th of November and so on, okay? And then we can say, well, I was, I guess, working and my older son had, been watching television and he came upstairs and said, the wall is fallen. And I said, you must be crazy. So much for insight at the time. So what I want to do tonight is present a reflection on the causes of the collapse of communism, on the revolutionary process, and also a brief synopsis of the results, because in my understanding, these three things belong together. Because if you want to, and I will sort of try to substantiate the thesis that this is a new kind of revolution, you know about a revolution only when you know about its aftermath. It's not just about the process. Okay? And in the German case, this is laden with confusions, but we will get to those in a moment. Now, here is the GDR, for those of you who have missed it. Somewhat squished by my lack of knowing how to fit it correctly. But you see the administrative districts and you see Berlin in the middle with the four powers. Now, let me begin with causes, because historians always want to go backwards, but I will not start with the Romans, so you can be sure I'm sure we get to the 1980s, 1990s in tonight's lecture. Historians conventionally divide causes into long-term reasons and short-term reasons. And the long-term ones are the structural ones, and the short-term ones have to do with events. Now, I will add a third category to it, which has been explored by Professor Pfaff, which has to do with mobilization. Because that is what then connects the two other levels of argumentation and actually creates a dynamic, which we need to explain. Now, perhaps it is kind of vulgar Marxism, or perhaps it's just vulgar. I want to start with economics, and I think there is relatively little debate about the stagnation of the GDR economy, the mounting foreign debt, and the fact that GDR productivity was only about 1/3 of that of West Germany, and that the East German money, you could already feel it, wasn't worth quite as much as various Western currencies. I once got held up for an hour crossing the border when I talked about, I had a 1 mark and 59 penny in my pocket from the day before, and was asked, do you have any money? East German money, and I kind of fumbled around and put it on the table and said, well, here. And then he said, how can you, and so on. I said, well, if you wanted, you can have your play money. Held in the cell for 1 hour. Yeah. I had to do yoga exercises in order to get my blood pressure down. Because once you are, you never know when you come out again. Anyway, there are still some post-communists who believe in East German economic statistics and who are convinced that the growth rate of East Germany was faster than West Germany. I think they have never seen the difference between the Trabi and the Gulf. That's all I can say about that. No, if you want to in the discussion, we can go into this and I can give you more details. All right. Part of the long-term reasons is also the spread of détente, and in German, the Verantwortungsgemeinschaft between Helmut Schmidt and Honecker in the picture here, because Reagan's Star Wars have some connection in terms of the arming to death of the Eastern Bloc because the economics were so expensive and so on. But at the high point of the Star Wars sort of tension, the wall didn't fall, it fell during détente. Okay? So you have to sort of work this one out. It's ideologically, of course, highly freighted in the United States and the American discourse, left and right and so on, but I'm one of the people who believes that it required détente for Gorbachev to repeal the Brezhnev doctrine and not the height of the arms race, and so on. So that I think, the kind of attempt of the Europeans to stay out of the nuclear conflagration and sort of sense even of the two German states have some special responsibility to maintain peace is part of it. Of course, it also has to do with the revival of civil society and the growth of opposition groups in the shelter of the Protestant more than the Catholic Church, because the Church offered a quasi-public space. Quasi-public because you had to go to a church in order to experience it. Public because anybody could enter. You didn't get asked whether you were baptized when you went in. And once you were in, you could talk about things relatively freely. This is a surprising thing. I have written about this in other contexts and can only hint at it. It's a society which has been, as Jürgen Kocher would say, durchherrscht, which has been structured through the Communist Party from the top down, and by the early 80s with the peace movement and so on, it begins to get Prenzlauer Berg cultural scene, rock concerts of the young, and so on. There are varieties of things that begin to happen that make it more plural, even under the drab and gray surface of East Germany. And finally, part of the long-term reasons for me is also the loss of confidence of the SED, in spite of the power display at the 40th anniversary in October 1989, when you see the Volksarmee still doing Prussian custom of goose-stepping. They knew what their traditions were by then. And on the Ehrentribüne, on the reviewing stand, there is, of course, Honecker and the military brass of Gorbachev, the leaders of the fraternal parties, and so on. Loss of confidence, why? Because the economy wasn't doing very well anymore, and a lot of people knew that. And also because after 1968 and the Prague Spring, and after martial law in Poland, the utopian globe had paled in communism, because it was really a consumer communism under Honecker and no longer an ideological cause. Now, these four things are some of the long-term reasons that erode the stability of the system. Okay? But a system can erode a long time and still stay standing unless it gets blown down by something. And there we get to the short-term events. And this concatenation of events has to do, first of all, with Gorbachev's reform attempts in the Soviet Union, because he wanted to modernize the economy of the Soviet Union. And for that, he had to restructure it. And in order to get that going, that's perestroika, he had to also open up public debate that is called glasnost. Okay? And you see, the East Germans had a proverb that says, to learn from the Soviet Union means learning how to win. And the East Wind had turned. Before, the East Wind was always Stalinist, conservative, and anti-liberalization in 53, 56, 68, and 81. Now the East Wind after 85 was actually melting the snow, which is, meteorologically a wonder. Politically also in America, and the ice, and things were starting to move again, except in Central Europe, in Prague, in East Germany, and in Romania, and in Bulgaria, and we forget Albania. The communist leaders were quaking in their boots. And part of it is, of course, the foreign policy. Too, if Gorbachev wants to reform the Soviet Union, he needs to deal with the West in a more positive way, and therefore he is also no longer promising to support local communist parties should they be challenged domestically. That is what the Brezhnev doctrine was, and since he is no longer believing with it, it's called Sinatra doctrine. One of the people working for him and so on, did it according to the pop song, I'll do it my way. And so the Poles could do it their way, maybe even the East Germans. Now, in the events, this is the framing condition of Gorbachev's repeal of the Brezhnev doctrine, because in 53 he had saved the SED. The next thing is the mass exodus, which relates to the opening of the Iron Curtain in Hungary and the slogan, "We want to get out." The building of the wall had brought communism in East Germany a couple of decades, even a little bit more, 28 years. But ultimately, of course, it also created a kind of a prison reflex. It's like a teenager, who's supposed to be home by 10 o'clock at night and who comes home after midnight, just because he should come home at 10 o'clock at night, because then, my older son liked to shoot baskets after midnight, in the local high school gym, because, of course, shooting baskets after midnight is so much better than shooting baskets at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. It's the same bloody hoop and so on, but, it has all this. So the East Germans, by being penned up, built up this tremendous need, to get out. And many of them took the part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, decided, former communist leadership decided, in the summer of 1989, to remove the Iron Curtain, or to at least open it, lift it a little bit in some places and so on. Then some of the tens of thousands of East Germans who were vacationing at Lake Balaton, at the Plattensee in German, and so on, then took their trolleys and drove them up to the border and ran across to get out, because they thought this was probably going to be the last chance they had to do that. And as a matter of fact, what happened is something like a kind of Torschlusspanik. That's a German word that means it's a panic that you have when you know the gate is about to be closed again. And you're going to have to be the last one who squeezes through. And so this summer '89, this Exodus thing is something that feeds on itself. It's a mass movement that also has repercussions in East Germany because, of course, people who had wanted to leave and weren't allowed to had before already gathered, and they gathered ever more publicly and had shouted, "Wir wollen raus," we want to get out. Okay? Now, when they were in the public, then the dissidents also decided to leave the shelter of the church and to demonstrate by shouting, "We are staying here. We won't go." I mean, hell no, but not to Vietnam, but stay in East Germany. Why? Because this was their home. They wanted to reform it. They wanted to create a kind of socialism with a human face, a kind of democratic socialism. That is the project of the opposition, of the dissidents, because this is a system-imminent opposition by the 1980s. The older anti-communist opposition had died down by 1961, and after the building of the wall, the Stasi was begotten. They were they had left, or they couldn't speak anymore. But these folks are people who criticize socialism via the Helsinki Accords and via the Constitution. And they want the rights that the Constitution theoretically has. Now, this is a very difficult to read graph, and I apologize for it. It's from Richter, from a new 2-volume study of Saxony, which is immensely detailed, and it's the best thing that we have. And the one curve is on the mass exodus, and the other one is on the demonstrations, and you see sort of the covariance of those curves. And so that is, the exit is connected to voice in the East German case, rather than being an alternative. And of course, it also has to do with the confusion in the party leadership, the tension between Gorbachev as a reformer and Honecker as a hardliner. Honecker was basically out of commission for 3 months in the summer of 1989, which is about the most stupid thing you can do when your country is in a major crisis. First he had vacation, then he had gallbladder surgery, and he came back for a few days, had a couple of meetings, and then he reconvalesced further because he was keying on the 40th anniversary celebration and not on the crisis that was happening. And if the party doesn't have sort of the leadership, then it doesn't react vigorously. Now, mobilization doesn't happen by itself because dissidents had before been doing candlelight vigils with 50 people and so on. And 50 people are a feast day for the local Stasi because they're just enough of them so that you have fun and you don't feel sorry for beating them up and locking them up and harassing them and checking their identity and doing all the other nasty kinds of things that boys will do when they have uniforms and power and they're entitled by the state to lean on some people. So the dissidents who had the courage to resist and to develop alternative plans are crucial as incipient leaders of opposition. And one of those is the Berlin Umweltbibliothek that was in the basement of one of the churches. And indeed it is a library because, somewhere you had to be able to read Silent Spring, other tracts on, and the Club of Rome, predictions and whatever, kind of lit, environmentalist fires. And of course, it is also people, you have to sort of look at the dude, who's standing there, Rübenklau. It's also about style, of being unangepasst, you get somebody like that as a recruit of the NVA, either the recruit wouldn't survive or the NVA wouldn't survive, because This is somebody who's opted out of the system, who is no longer manipulated by being told you can't advance in your profession and stuff like this. This is somebody, who is in fundamental opposition. And, without that courage, nothing would have happened. So there has to be a core. Secondly, I think the media history of 1989 is vastly understood, that is, or under-analyzed and so on, because there were no free media in East Germany. The Western media, after sort of quasi-recognition, were in the East, and of course Western television was available. And towards the end of the GDR, they even put a cable system into Dresden, so that Western channels were in Dresden, which was formerly known as the Valley of the Clueless, because Western towers couldn't reach there. And the Western journalists reported this, and of course when people came out on the Austrian side and then arrived in Bavaria, they were immediately given passports, and this is what they're doing here. They're showing the new West German passports, because West Germany maintained that these folks were still Germans and therefore they should have immediate access to citizenship, which is a kind of destabilizing policy, and it's a welcome policy because not only did they get passports, they also got housing help, they got help finding jobs, and so on. There was all sorts of stuff that made it easier to go from one part. And if you look at the ages of these folks here, 25 to 35, maybe 40, and so on, these are young, these are dynamic, these are some of the best. This is the future of the GDR that's leading. And without Western television pictures, who would have known? It wasn't in the Neue Deutschland. Only they eventually printed the story about a waiter on a long-distance train who was supposed to have been drugged and dragged into the West, and then treated badly. And about 10 days later, the Neue Deutschland had to recant and had to admit that they had all made it up. Because why would the West have to drug a waiter on a train, if tens of thousands of people were streaming across the border, on their own? But it shows you the propaganda warfare over the media. And the point is that these pictures are very emotional. They are not pictures that go to your head. They went at least, somewhere. I'm not sure if it's the heart or if it's somewhat further down, to your belly, to the gut, or whatever. But it's a sort of immediate emotional sort of visceral response is what I'm trying to say. And that of course is also part of the process, because it creates sympathy. Who can be against that, even if that costs money and it has bad consequences, and you have relatives that you don't really want to recognize. Women in dowdy dresses and men in plastic suits and so on. That wouldn't be worn in the West for the last 15 or 20 years. Now, another aspect of this mobilization, of course, is the question of overcoming individual fear. And I think for that, demonstration experience is crucial, because you are suppressible as long as you're alone. Because if you're alone against the 500,000 armed forces, People's Army, People's Police, Stasi, and factory militias. The GDR had 4 different kinds of various armed organs and so on. Then you feel powerless, and you're not going to do anything. You're just going to pull your head in. But once you're out in public space and you see that other people are joining you, you get a sense of solidarity. This is what the traditional labor movement used to do. Only here they are semi-spontaneous. And this is of course the Alexanderplatz one on the 4th of November. There's potentially 500,000 people. It's more complicated because it was still partly organized by the party. We can talk about it. But the psychological response is the same, that when you're together with another 10,000 people or so, then you are at a point where you're no longer afraid. And when you're no longer afraid, you speak out, you shout, you point, paint posters and stuff, and you demand your rights. And finally, of course, it also has to do with the party again. And this is a dimension that is often under-analyzed in the literature and also in the anniversary stuff and so on, because the communists are kind of stooges and dupes, and they're not really in the story. That's stupid from a historical point of view, because they still have power. And whatever they decide is what's going to go or not go. And of course, on the 18th of October, Honecker is finally kicked out, and Krenz becomes his successor, and he announces a policy of controlled dialogue, except in his first television address, the first two words cost him his job. Are fundamentally wrong. Does anybody know what the first two words were? He said, "Dear comrades." Now, why was "Dear comrades" wrong? Because this was a speech which he had prepared for the party, for the Central Committee, and he was treating the population of the GDR as if they were all communists, and they're just trying to get out from under. If he had said, "Dear citizens of the GDR," maybe the Wende would have had a bit more of a chance. Okay, I'm just dramatizing it, but the point is that Krenz has no credibility. Okay, now, this is the sort of first bunch of stuff that I wanted to talk about. Causes, structural causes, short-term events, and mobilization process, all interacting and creating a kind of process of what? Of contention. That's the new, one of the new social science words for this, for civil unrest. That's former is McAdam, the other one is Timothy Garden Ashett. So, in old-fashioned historical lingo, it's a popular uprising. That happens. The interesting thing is, of course, that the first demand in a dictatorship is for human rights, or for civil rights. Why? Because you need those in order to do anything else. This is the most basic thing. Okay? Because if you want to improve the economy, you want to travel, you want to change the policies of the government, you have to be able to ask for it in public. You have to be able to dramatize. Okay? And that, of course, is the reason for the slogan, "We are the people," in contrast to you, the armed forces, or the police, or the government, or whatever. Do you understand that? And that's, of course, a quote from any number of different things, including the United States Constitution, and so on. And it has to do with the German word Volk, which, and this most people don't know, in the first half of the 19th century was a left word, which the radical Democrats and then the socialists used before the radical right, the folkish people, and the racist and the anti-Semites stole it, and then it became the Volksgemeinschaft of the Nazis and stuff like this. But the East Germans tried to take it back with the Volkskammer and Volkspolizei and Volksarmee and Volks this, that, and the other, Volkswohlfahrt, and so on. And that's why when the people say, "We are the people," they're basically giving the government the bird. They're telling the government, buzz off. Okay. Now, it also means once you begin to have human rights again, you can organize in public. Why is this crucial? Because if you're organizing in somebody's kitchen, and 1/3 of your members are working for the Stasi already anyway, and so on, and in another town you're organizing there and so on, you may be sort of spreading, the metaphors that occur to me are athletic, and I don't want to use them, so I won't use them. But you're spreading kind of subterraneously, but you're not generating any kind of power. You have to be in public space with it, okay? And the first one, of course, is the Neue Forum, and some of you will recognize the folks, Bella in the middle, and Jens Reich next to her, and so on, in one of the churches, organizing. And the Neue Forum, as a kind of program, has this program of recovering civil rights. Okay? That's all. The Neue Forum wants to create debate about the future of the GDR. Everybody can talk without determining in what direction it should go. Okay? So the Neue Forum is immensely popular, a couple 100,000 signatures or something like that within the first 6 or 8 weeks. But of course it is also very weak, because even when it gets accepted officially, then it doesn't have a good program. Because once the state allows public space and the measure of human rights, then what? that's when politics begin. That's not where they end. And so the Neue Forum is a kind of phase, in this, and the other ones, like the SDP and the Demokratische Aufbruch and whatever, Demokratie Jetzt and whatever, these already are much more programmatically focused. Now, important in all of that is also the recapturing of public space, not just sort of writing petitions or coming to a town meeting organized by reformist communists and stuff like that. That's still all under party control. Capturing public space is crucial because that is where, in classic democratic theory, and also in practice, of course, the debate about the open debate of the citizens has to take place. If there are no other meeting places and so on, it's out in the streets. And this happens in a peaceful fashion, as you all know, on October 9th in Leipzig. It is the first miracle of sorts of this German revolution, because a group of three mid-level party secretaries and military staff of Leipzig and 3 cultural figures, Konrad Jarausch, and 2 other ones and so on, agree on an appeal for nonviolence. And this is crucial because this is all taking place in the shadow of the 4th of June, Tiananmen Square in China, and both the demonstrators and the forces of the government don't want to do this. This is, that's crucial because it takes 2 to tango. If you want to be nonviolent, the demonstrators should not, lynch any policemen and stuff like this, and the police shouldn't shoot any demonstrators and stuff. And although things verge on violence, especially in the beginning of October in Dresden, when the trains from Prague go through the GDR, one of the greatest blunders that the government made, in the fall, among many blunders, there was fighting. They destroyed pieces of the main train station in Dresden, and stuff. So it wasn't completely, but it goes to the brink of violence, and then both sides decide to contain it. Why does the government contain it? Because one of the numbers that's always bandied about is 70,000 people. It may not have been quite that many. Demonstrators always count double. It's if you're in the demonstration, the numbers seem much larger. The police they shrink, and the police looks at them. So, but it's several tens of thousands. And that number is too large, unless you want to have a big bloodbath. And there we are again at the stalled economy. Why don't you have a big bloodbath? Because then your credits from the West are going to go. It's quite clear that the West German government will not pay for anything anymore, and so on. And so you are in a situation where certain kinds of things can't be done that way anymore as before. Now, the crucial part of it is that the first phase of this popular uprising is reformist, because the slogans all want a reform of the GDR. Now we have to think about that a little bit. They want rights, they want to get rid of specific people, like Honecker to begin with, and then Krenz and so on, and then they want to change specific government policies. Okay? These are all attempts to create a better GDR. Okay. And so far, this is a kind of contention on a mass basis. The demonstrations get ever bigger. A couple 100,000 in Dresden on Monday night and so on. In Leipzig. But it is still reformist. And one of the analytical challenges is to figure out when does it become revolutionary. And my answer is, at the point when they don't just want Honecker gone, when they want communism gone. When it is no longer a matter of exchanging the government or sharing power or reforming specific policies, but getting rid of the system altogether. Okay? And this is a crucial moment because this is where the dissidents and the majority of the population diverge. Because the dissidents, by and large, still want to reform the GDR. And the majority of the population, the so-called silent majority, wants to get rid of the system altogether. Because they have in front of their noses a place where they want to be, and it's called West Germany. which complicates matters, of course, in the German case. Okay. And this you can't really read, you know, I mean, I'm going to go over it because I'm sorry. It's just a bad copy of the diagram. You know, and, you know, the Richter study has done, you know, enormously detailed analysis of what themes come. And the early themes, I have a better graph later, are all for the reform of the GDR, and then sort of from the middle of November on and so on, this reform of the GDR theme gets replaced by German unification. Okay, I mean, that's the phases. I mean, when you study the slogans, you know, that were chanted or painted, you know, on the posters and stuff like this, you can actually figure out, you know, when the populace goes from one. Oh, and one other point about that. Where am I? Okay, fine. Yeah. Okay. Now, this far, this is a classic sort of revolt becoming a revolution, but it deviates. It diverges from the pattern at this point for two major reasons. It stays nonviolent, and the American Revolution was violent. There's a war. There's Great Britain. The French Revolution has the Jacobins. Okay? The Bolshevik Revolution has the Red and White Terror, and so on. But what does 1989 not have, except in Romania, is bloodshed. Okay? This is astounding. And this is one of the reasons why some people even say it wasn't a revolution at all. Now, some of the nonviolent turn has to do with the limited concessions, such as the travel policy, which leads to the fall of the wall, and that's, of course, November 9th, and you all have read and heard the story of Jarausch and so on enough times. The only thing I want to say about it is that Hans-Hermann Hertler, a member of my former institute, has done the best work on it. And actually, this is the case where television reports an event before it happens. Because the 8 o'clock news had it already on West German television, and then I think the Heute Nachrichten, etc., you know, added again. And it's only after the second 10 o'clock, something or other, that people actually go to the border crossing points and begin to test it. And then there's another aspect of it. Tom Brokaw was there with the TV team on the other side of the Brandenburg Gate, you know, waiting for something to happen. And then when people suddenly started appearing on top and climbing one way and the other way and started dancing and so on, he had pictures. And those are the ones that went around the world. And that's why, of course, the East Europeans feel kind of hijacked. You know, so they're kind of angry at the Germans because the fall of the wall has become a metaphor for 89. And the Poles, of course, say, we started it, Solidarność, you know, the Hungarian state, you know, we started it, you know, and so on. You can, you know, imagine the rest. Now, let me get back, you know, to the limited concession. If this had been a regime that made no concessions at all, then, you know, we don't know whether violence wouldn't have, at some point, also broken out. So, you know, these are belated concessions. They're never enough. You know, the regime is driven by popular demand, you know, and they always give in a little bit, and they're always leaping too short, as the cliche has it in German. Now, it also has to do, of course, with the opposition, which was not a Leninist cadre party, but rather a bunch of 40-somethings intellectuals, and as the Germans say, Aussteiger, people, you know, who had kind of left the system. And while they really hated the Stasi, and in December and January occupied the Stasi offices and stuff like this, they did not really feel competent to seize power themselves, because they thought, gee, don't I really have to know how to run the sewage system? And what is it, you know, if, you know, the power grid goes out overnight and so on, are you really capable of doing that? And this may be, you know, a kind of diffidence that they shouldn't have had, but it also means that it goes for nonviolence, because if you're not violently grabbing power, then the people that have the power don't have to defend it violently. Okay? Instead, what they do is, okay, here are the anti-Stasi slogans. They're also very nice, but you don't need them. Instead, they create a round table, and the government agrees because the government has power, but no legitimacy, and the dissidents, the opposition, has legitimacy, but no power. So, you know, they are sort of meeting as equals, and you see that the round table is square, and it has clergy mediating, and so on. It has the same number from the opposition groups as it has various kinds of government organization folks, and they argue about how to reform the GDR. They do not talk about getting rid of it. And their crowning achievement is, after the election, the constitutional proposal, which invents a kind of grassroots left democracy, which is a very nice document, except, of course, it was politically not tenable because the East German population didn't want to have that kind of democracy, at least not the majority. Now, what they agree upon eventually is the mechanism of election as a method of deciding who holds power. Because if you can have elections, you don't have to kill each other. It sounds simple, but if you go to some of the third world countries where you have contested elections and so on, the killing isn't so funny. I mean, my remark isn't quite as stupid as it sounds, I hope. Because you see, the people who have power, who have still 500,000 party members, there were 2.3 million before it melts down, but still 500,000 is a lot of people. And the offices, the newspaper, TV stations, and other things, and so on, unions, and so on, they can think that they might be able to hang on to power, or at least enough of power in order to make the transition into the new system. Whereas the opposition can also believe that there is so much groundswell of opposition that they can indeed have a chance to win, if there's an election. So an election is a mechanism that is civil or civilized, and that substitutes for beating each other over the head and making blood flow in the streets, simply also because, of course, the power relationship is so uneven. Because there are about 2,500 dissidents in the summer of 1989 and 500,000 armed forces of one kind or another, and you don't seriously think that 2,500 people can overthrow that kind of power. You have to use other kinds of means. You use media, you use demonstrations, and you use elections. And the elections, of course, take place in March and give a fairly clear mandate, and the mandate is for unification as the quick road to system change. And this is the Wir sind not das Volk, sondern ein Volk. Okay? Where, West German satirists made Ich bin Volker out of this one, but that's neither here nor there. It's a stupid German joke. Now, unification is a conceptual problem in understanding all of this because it is a different frame. It shifts this to state building, and the parallel is 1870, 71, and so on in the German case. My contention is that unification is the form in which the revolution in Germany is implemented. Okay? This is a different thesis. In the other East European countries, they have to struggle on their own to agree on how to do it. In the GDR, they can have an election, and they can thereby vote themselves into a neighboring country and have ready-made answers which then descend upon them. Okay? But it's kind of an invited takeover, and that's one of the reasons why I had problems with the Anschluss metaphor, because it has these Hitler overtones and stuff. And I think, Kohl may not be somebody whom you would want to have at your next cocktail party, but because he's so massive, he's old and immobile these days. Sorry, I do, but doesn't mean that he was Hitler. Folks, that is, rhetoric is one thing, but comparisons are something else. See, this is this other graph. On the first hump, you see the reform GDR part, and the second one that goes up into the air and is interrupted and then goes back up. That's German unification. You can time fairly exactly when the first one disappears and the other one comes. Now, this of course has to do also with the fall of the wall. The rest had been a myth in East Germany already. because the retired people were allowed to travel, which was very convenient for East Germany because some of them stayed in the West and then the East didn't have to pay their pensions. It's a great way to get rid of your demography problem and keep your population young. And of course, some of the younger people had travel permits and stuff for relatives, and some of them that stayed in the West as well. And the open border, of course, allowed all those people who were not in Eisenkarte, who had not permission to travel before, to see the Western system and experience it. And of course, they saw what they had seen on television, namely the glittering surface. You go into a Western, even Aldi, and you have 25 different forms of toilet paper. And I love that as a metaphor because the East Germans had this gray industrial tissue, which looked like it had sand on it and felt like it as well. It sort of did okay unless you had diarrhea, in which case it was very good. If you go from that to the 25 different kinds of scented, 2 layers, 3 layers, absorbent, super absorbent, and whatever, flowers on it. Anyway, then this must have blown their mind. The difference. And so it's not very surprising that then they said to themselves, well, gee, why can't we be there? And why did we have to be occupied by the Russians and not by the Americans? And why, especially if you were in Leipzig, why did the Americans go home in 1945? They were there to begin with. So the pull of the open border is immense. This, of course, leads eventually to the dissolution of the GDR. The Volkskammer vote for the accession to the Federal Republic, according to paragraph 23, because this is the Krieg way. 146 was the nicer, sort of more equal and more deliberative way of creating a new joint constitution, but they might have been added for 5 years or longer if they had done it. The Western leadership, Kohl, Schäuble, and so on, they were all convinced that they had a window of opportunity that might slam shut at any point because the situation with Gorbachev was so unstable in the Soviet Union. This is the result of the first free elections, which is an enormous surprise because the CDU alliance itself gets 40%, and then some of the minor parties with it get another 8%. In spite of the fact that this is Protestant territory, and the CDU is basically a Catholic party, or a majority Catholic party. And the great losers were the SPD. Of course, that had something to do with electoral polling, because folks that did the polling were Westerners, and they polled by telephone. And they didn't understand who would have telephones in the East and who would not have telephones. The people whom they reached overwhelmingly, intelligentsia and cadres and so on, they were either for the PDS, or for the SPD, and it's a working class vote for a conservative or middle of the road party. That's the great surprise. And it's a sort of 3/4 vote for rapid unification. That is the point here. And then, of course, the unification treaty that stipulates the legal form of transformation. There is a customs and social monetary union and so on. Before, that's complicated because the GDR does go bankrupt in the summer. De Maizière wanted to have the GDR exist another 2 to 4 years. One of the people in his cabinet told me this again the other day and so on. But he doesn't make it more than a few months. This is short because of some treaties. Okay. Now, so the process is revolutionary. It escalates from reform to revolution. Okay? And it is different from classical revolutions because it is peaceful, it is non-violent in Germany, and in Germany it takes a national turn. It leads into unification. Okay. Now, what about some of the consequences? My thesis is that the consequences support the thesis of the revolution because they're awesome. That is, all you had to do was be an East German, so live through them, to know, because you see a caesura, in history, you judge a caesura in history by the degree of consequences it has for people's everyday life. Okay, not by a press conference or some kind of thing that the government does or some pundits say. So But when they start telling you life stories before the Wende and after the Wende, then you know something has happened there. Okay. Now, what was it? Domestic transformation to begin with, the revival of democracy, elections in March, in May, local elections and national elections in October, and Kohl basically gets a second lease on life. He should have lost that election if Lafontaine hadn't been such an idiot and irresponsible populist. I'm sorry that he has cancer, but I think he's a pest on German politics. So, he blew a historic chance. The social market economy, of course, is also something surprising. I talked about it a moment ago already. This is just a picture of some of the Western products arriving in Dresden. And it leads, of course, to terrible consequences because Easterners found the Western goods so much more appealing that they didn't buy their own stuff anymore, which meant that lots of their own companies went under. This is a table that shows you the affiliation. You show the people who want the market are the more conservative ones for the Deutsche, for the CDU and for the Peasant League and whatever, and the ones that want a sort of non-market system are the people on the left. That's kind of predictable. It also has to do with the recovery of cultural pluralism. One of the great moments was Rolf Biermann's first concert in the East again. Here is with Lafontaine, who is in a good mood, so I played everything back. So hard on him and so on, but he has played, I think, at pernicious well. And then of course you had the actual act of unification on October 3rd, 1990, which fortunately enough was non-triumphalist. There was no military parade, and so on. And in my book, it shows also some of the transformation that the Germans had undergone in the previous decades, that they were able to do this in a fairly friendly and civilized fashion. How about the international repercussions? Of course, I have not talked about grand diplomacy at all because of my focus on the GDR and on the internal process of tonight. These were more complicated than they seem in retrospect, because there was hardly anybody who was for unification. Only after some hemming and hawing, the American administration, the senior Bush, played a very constructive role and has not gotten the credit for it. It should have gotten for it. And surprisingly enough, the dissidents in Poland and in Czechoslovakia, because they had realized, Michnik and various other ones, Ceramic and so on, that the road to the West lay through the GDR. And if they wanted to get back to the West, they had to get rid of the GDR. And there was a very easy way to get rid of the GDR, let it join the Federal Republic. And, okay, that required, of course, settling the border question, and Kohl dragged his feet because of the electoral politics of the refugees. This is not one of the better episodes of it. But eventually, of course, even Gorbachev was persuaded. Before that happened, I think, the lady with the handbag had to give in. The British Foreign Ministry, Douglas Hurd, was in favor of unification, and so was a good part of British public opinion. But the British Yellow Press and Maggie Thatcher, were virulently against it because the Brits still sort of live in the Second World War. Whenever they have a sort of international soccer game against the Germans, the Huns are coming. And, of course, they have a problem because one of the British players said, a definition of soccer is 11 people play, there's a ball, and the Germans win. That's the idea there.